You know, you hear this from time to time, you know, that you have to let something die so that it can be reborn. But the only problem with that is our whole concept is on the idea that it will be reborn. The solution and the remedy of it. Like, God, if I give this to you, you're going to give it back to me. What if he doesn't? And unless you're willing to give it completely without getting it back, is it really sacrifice? Or are you just getting to get? Well, Lord, if I surrender this to you, you're going to give it back to me 4 times and 2 times. And how about if I give this to you and it dies and never comes back? You're enough. Because when something dies, it dies. It dies in our hearts. We understand there's no other options, and it's God's, and it's God's alone. That's death. So we are in our Jesus in the Temple series. This is the finale of Jesus in the Temple, and this is Mount Moriah. Jesus in the Temple, Mount Moriah. So we're going to end at the beginning. We're going to end at the beginning, getting the history of this plot of ground in which the temple was built and all the implications of its geography there, Mount Moriah, capital of Jerusalem. And so Jesus in the Temple, Mount Moriah. We may come back later and do a bonus sermon on Jesus in the Temple, but just one, and that may happen in the future, but I got to do some more study before we present that. I don't want to come ill-prepared. And so here we are at the finale of Jesus in the Temple. We've walked through the Temple series. We understand all the elements of worship, the brazen altar, the altar of incense, the table of shewbread, the Ark of the Covenant, all of these things that related to the temple, but also studying the temples of the past. The Mishkan, which was established by God through Moses. Then we see David and Solomon's heart in the erection of the temple of God in Jerusalem. Then we see the destruction of that temple and Zerubbabel's temple and the recreation of the temple. Well, then later we see Herod the Great's temple and the temple that we're interacting with in Jesus in the temple that Jesus interacts with, these noteworthy moments. And so I pray that those of you who have been able to walk through this entire thing understand the implications of this plot of ground. And I pray that as you study your word and you see, as Jesus taught in the temple, it brings a whole new light to your studies. When you see the words, they did not touch him because they feared the people, that you know the implications of that and what's going on. And so we are now starting at the beginning. In this slide, you're going to see ancient Mount Moriah, the elevation of ancient Mount Moriah, the Kidron Valley, known as the Valley of Jehoshaphat there, which separates the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. The Mount of Olives where we see Jesus was betrayed. The Mount of Olives where he arrives to Jerusalem on a donkey, going toward the eastern gate of the temple, crossing the Kidron Valley. And in that slide, the Valley of Jehoshaphat. This shows you the elevation of the land of the Bible before there was anything there, before the Jebusites came and took that ground that was later conquered by David as he destroyed the Jebusites. And so you're going to see the ascent from the city of David. You can see the elevation. You'll see that on a lot of these slides today as you see that this is not Colorado mountains. This isn't the Tetons. This isn't the Rocky Mountains. These are Middle Eastern mountains, a little bit more low-lying mountains. And so we're looking at now this ascent. We've walked through the pilgrim's journey from the Pool of Siloam, which you see in the picture, up to the Temple Mount. And so we understand this plot of ground. And as you get to the top of that, we see that Herod the Great takes and makes a shoebox around the top of Mount Moriah and backfills it to make a flat top worship structure that is still there to this day. The remnants of the stones that Herod the Great and his sons laid are still there. You can touch them. You can see them with your own eyes. In this series, we've looked at pictures of those. then you see an aerial view of that same plot of ground. That's it today from the sky. We're going all the way back to the beginning of Abraham as he interacts with this mountain. At the top of that mountain, you're going to have the Dome of the Rock. The only way you can enter the Dome of the Rock is if you are a Muslim. You can't fake it unless you are well versed in the writings of Muhammad, unless you're well versed in the Quran, because they'll quiz you. If you get to that area, and I've seen it happen, I've seen some Caucasian women from America step up to it and try to gain entry, and them laugh at them because, well, they claim they're a Muslim. Well, you ain't the Muslim. I'm the kind of Muslim that I am because you don't know this, this, and this. And so they'll quiz you. And if you pass the test, then you can enter the Dome of the Rock. To this day, as a Christian, you cannot enter the Dome of the Rock. It's called the Dome of the Rock for a reason, because there's a dome over a rock. Pretty simple, right? That rock is said to be where Abraham offers Isaac. It's where the Muslim people believe that Abraham offers Ishmael. It's the division in Judaism and the Muslim belief system, where they would track from Ishmael. And they're correct in that. That is their ancestry. And Isaac is the ancestry of the Jewish people. But this is the rock where they believe that Abraham laid down his son and was ready to offer him up to the Lord. This is the Dome of the Rock. This is what is there today. You can go on top of Temple Mount, but you can't gain access to this inside of the Dome of the Rock unless you have converted and you're willing and able to pass the test of what it means to be a Muslim. And so I'm going to give you a quick backstory. Now we understand the geography that we're interacting with. We're going back to the beginning. We've already walked through the end of the story, which is Jesus interacting with the temple, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And now we're going back before there was a temple, before there was a city, before anyone had claimed that ground. Over 4,000 years ago, a man named Abram was called to follow God. Let's look at this as we understand this story. Let's look at this ground, and we'll start in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. We need to understand who's interacting with this geography in this passage. And so we're going to be introduced to Abraham. Abraham has left his hometown. He's left his own people, and God has called him to a land that's not his. He's made him a promise that he will be fruitful and multiply, and he will be the father of many nations. The only problem is Abraham's 75 and his wife is barren. Now, today we typically quit having babies. You get above 40 and they begin to call it a geriatric pregnancy. That means that after 40, a woman's body typically is not going to be able to withstand a baby and do the things it needs to do because she's older and she's past the years of childbirth. And so what we see if women give birth later on in life are many defects and things of that nature. We see Down syndrome and other things that come from late pregnancies. And it's crazy because in the West, typically, we have a different trajectory. Women go to college, they get jobs, and once they get established, then they have children. In the Bible, they're having children pretty close to puberty. These girls are going through the change of the body that will allow them to have children, and then, which is the way God created the system, and then not too far after that, they're given away to a husband, and then they're able to have children. At this healthy period of their life, what we've seen in the West is a little change in that. But this isn't a medical journal this morning or discussion, but you need to understand Abraham's 75, Sarah is up there in age as well, right along with Abraham, and she is barren. She hasn't had children this entire time in her life. It's not going to happen medically. It's not going to happen. We see that in our day and age. We see women that are barren, and we have a lot of great medical practices today, such as in vitro fertilization, and a number of things that enable us to aid a woman in her labor and delivery and pregnancy. But back then, it was not the case. And so she was barren. He was 75, but yet God made him a promise. I'm going to make you the father of many nations. What do you mean the father of many nations? My wife, Sarah, she's past childbearing age. She can't have kids. We've tried. I'm sure there were tears wept. I've seen a woman who's gone through infertility, and it is gut-wrenching as they desperately want to have a child. You can imagine all that went on with Abraham and Sarah. It can create a great strain on a marriage. When a father desperately wants a son or a daughter, and she's unable to produce that child. So we see this tension immediately as Abraham is called out. You're going to see this in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, that he's 75 and he's called out. So something happens at the age of 86. So he's 75, he's called. Now we have many years later, at the age of 86, Sarah says, I can't have kids, Abraham. Can't have kids. We know this. And I'm paraphrasing here. How about we do this? How about we take this concubine, this maidservant, Hagar, and how about you have sex with Hagar, and produce a child through her, because I can't have a child. Let's figure out another way to do this. So there's God's plan, what He has promised, and then there's impatience and humanity. And I'm not above it. If anybody's impatient, I'm impatient. I get it. But they're then at this point where they're trying to figure out how to help God, right? God, you've promised this. This is the promise God has. It's not happening this way. It's impossible for me to have kids. Sarah understands this. That's why she's presented this ridiculous option. She can't have children. She knows she can't. She's tried and she's tried and she's tried through great pain and tears and grief. So she says, take Hagar. So Abraham is complicit in this compromise as well. Abraham agrees. So it's not just Sarah that's the weaker vessel, that's struggling with faith and trusting in God. Abram is in the same place. And so they make a plan to help God out. They make a plan to help God out. 86, he fathers Ishmael. Well, just like you would think, it causes some tension in the relationship. Never was a good idea to go outside of God's plan and His will for their lives. It was their plan and their will butting up against God's. And so they pushed the envelope. Can we still do that today? Absolutely. There's God's plan for your life. There's His will for you. Then there's our impatience in the middle, His promises to you. And then there's our impatience in the middle that wants to make some other way to make it happen. Be careful in trying to help God. Abraham is over 100 years old when he goes to offer Isaac. When he was given Isaac, I'm sorry. So here we have it. So we got the ages here. 75, he's given the promise. 86, they compromise that promise. They try to do it on their own. And at the age of over 100 years old, we don't know exactly where that's at, but over 100, just over 100, he's given Isaac. You see that long waiting period? We have a hard time waiting 13 months. Abraham waited for over 25 years until the actual promise happens. 25 years. That's an entire lifetime for some. So now we find ourselves in our text, Genesis chapter 22, and we're going to look at our first point, which is the test. Let's read verse 1 and 2. Sometime after these things, and so after what things? Everything that I've just described to you. The compromise with Ishmael, the promise originally from God, and then the promised child finally being given. Can you imagine the news? Abram, I think I'm pregnant. Excuse me? Can you imagine the emotions all pent up for over 25 years. All the arguments, all the frustration, all the fear, all the doubt, all the impatience, all culminating to this point where Abraham, I'm pregnant. Whew. The relief, the revelation of God's sovereignty and His faithfulness, the understanding of His weakness and His compromise and all that he had failed in trusting in God. But that God is faithful and He will do what He said He would do. He is faithful to reveal His promise. Sometime after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am. Abraham replied, God said, take your son, your only son whom you love. Let me read that again. Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will indicate to you. What? 25 plus years? The promise has been revealed, the struggle, the difficulty to get to that point, and now, give me your only son. Let me say, first of all, the test is for you, not God. God is testing Abraham. This isn't about Abraham testing God. This is about God testing Abraham. Now, what I don't want to do is to create some scenario today where there's your hopes and dreams and what you desire to accomplish and what you believe God has promised you in your own understanding, and then take this story and overlay it. I don't want to do that today, but there is an understanding of sacrifice that we can learn from this sacrifice of Abraham. So I'm not here to belittle what's happening here, because ultimately we're talking about the summation of all things, the Lamb of God that was slain from the foundations of the earth. We're not talking about your hopes and dreams, your job opportunities, and the greatness you desire to achieve in life. But there is still, at the core of this, a principle of sacrifice, of patience and waiting on God and His promises in our life, and then giving back to God that which He's given us. Yes, we set this aside as something holy and reverent and something other than that, but we still look at the principles at the depth of this, and we ask God to challenge us. And the reality is, the test is for you, not him. So, what happens with this test? The test reveals your reality. So what I want you to see here is that this test is given to Abram, the biggest test of his entire life. He's waited long enough. He's gone through the hardship. And what we see in all that hardship is that he's learned something. He's learned surrender. He's learned to trust in God. Through what? Through failure? Absolutely. Through lack of patience? Absolutely. All of that. And we can relate that to our own lives and our impatience and our trusting in God. The test is for you, not him. And there will be a moment in your life where he puts his finger on something in your life and he says, I must have it. Is it because he needs it? My friend, God is in need of nothing.
That's right.
God is in need of nothing. You need it. It's for your well-being. It was for Abraham's well-being. It was this understanding that he was going to fill the promise through this beautiful story of ultimately giving his only son on Calvary. He's surrendering to this process. And we see that in verse 1 and 2. There's a lot of points, so we'll be moving pretty quickly through these points. The second point is in verse 3 and 4. Let's read those. Early in the morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young servants with him, along with his son Isaac. When he had cut the wood for the burnt offering, he started out for the place God had spoken to him about. On the third day, Abram caught sight of the place in the distance. caught sight of the place in the distance. So what do we see here in this action on Abraham's part? First of all, let me remind you of Sodom and Gomorrah. When the angel appears to Abraham and says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, what does Abraham do? He argues with him. He says, but Lord, will you save the city for 100 people? Yeah. Just hang with me for a minute. Will you save the city for 75? My numbers are off, but you get the picture. Will you save the city for 50? Oh, yes. What if there's 20 righteous? It says back and forth. You do not see that in this passage. Why? Because he's walked through over 25 years of hardship, of learning to trust in God, of difficulty. Let me tell you, man, God is shaping your life in a place like this. The hardship, the difficulty, the things that feel unfair, all of it, we embrace it because we know that God is testing and proving and bringing about something of great worth in us. This value is eternal. So we see this response. He's not arguing with God. He's not saying, well, okay, God, how about I go find Ishmael? Maybe I can offer him. Or maybe there's some other option. He immediately responds. It's not the interaction he had with Sodom and Gomorrah, which just arguing for his cousin Lot's life. We're talking about his only son, the son of his promise. And he says not a word, but he moves in action. May we get to that place in our lives. But unfortunately, friend, the only way there is through hardship and struggle and the forming in God's hand. To where we can get to that place where we say, yes, I'm done arguing, man. I'm done trying to convince you that my way is better. God, I move and respond to you. So next we see that he makes provision for the journey. He cuts up wood and he creates the necessary items to be able to offer a sacrifice. And then we see that it's a 3-day journey. 3 days. He's responded immediately. And sometimes we can respond immediately, but if there's a little bit of period in between then, we could easily resort back to questioning the entire process. But he does not. One foot in front of the other, with his son next to his side, walking with him. Isaac is no longer a baby. He's a little boy or a young man. And they were walking 3-day journey. Day 1, Lord, I surrender my heart. My only son, the promise I've waited for my entire life, God. I've waited for this great joy that I had when I heard that my wife was pregnant, the beauty I saw when I held my little baby boy, and I brought him into my arms, and I heard him coo, and I heard him awe, and I embraced the warm little body, and that was my boy. Can you imagine day 1? But God, if you ask it, he's yours. Can you imagine day 2 as they woke up for the day ahead and the journey, and God still had not provided a way out? The thoughts going through his head. And I remember when he was 1 year old, man. I remember when he first started to walk. When he started to get his equilibrium and I saw him walk for the first time, and I was so proud of my little boy. What about day 3? When he wakes up and there still seems to be no provision for a sacrifice except his son. Now, you may find this odd, and history may find it a little odd that sacrifice of a son would be asked. And ultimately, there's a lot of speculation here, but the reality is, in the end, Isaac is not offered. See, in that day, Deuteronomy had not been written yet. Deuteronomy explicitly tells us, the law and the prophets explicitly tell us, child sacrifice is forbidden. Abraham had not been told this yet. This had not been written, but God is asking for this, and it's not abnormal because ancient civilizations have offered child sacrifices. The worship of Molech is one of the most prominent, where their children were offered up to the fake god, if you will, Molech. So it wasn't abnormal. And so when this was asked of him, Moses responds, this is something that's happening in the land. It's not abnormal. Sacrifice, a matter of fact, is not abnormal even to this day. The majority of world religion understands sacrifice. At its core, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, all understand sacrifice, that we are giving something to God that costs something. That something's got to die, that we're not where we need to be, and there has to be something to die in our stead, that we are guilty at our core. Even in some superficial way, we understand sacrifice in the West. That we've got to sacrifice our time and our efforts, and like I said, in a superficial way, to get to some goal. It's innate, it's within us, it's universal at our core. Sacrifice. Now in our culture, it would tell you that you got to sacrifice and get in the gym. You got to work hard and you got to eat right, and you're going to be able to sacrifice to get to where you want to be. Why? Because you're not where you need to be. So even at that superficialness, there's a core that is sacrifice that we understand. We're not where we need to be. We need to get something else. So the sacrifice is not abnormal. It's at the root and the core of world religion and the core of our own hearts. So he doesn't shrink back on day 1, day 2, day 3, and now he sees a mountain in the distance. Let's read verse 5. So he said to his servants, you two stay here. So at this point, he's got some servants with him that are helping him on this 3-day journey. It's not just him and Isaac, but now it's just him and Isaac. So he said to his servants, you two stay here. Listen to this. With the donkey, while the boy and I go up there, we will worship, and then we will return to you. You see a pronunciation of faith and we see this fulfilled in the book of Hebrews. As it tells us that Abraham believed that God could even resurrect Isaac. So that makes me think that on this 3-day journey that Abraham knows, man, that my promised son, I waited 25 years, that's my boy, I've seen him grow. I know that he's the fulfillment. I know he is. Day 1, where's the sacrifice? Isaac. Day 2, where's the sacrifice? Isaac. Day 3, where's the sacrifice? Now it's time to walk up the mountain, and there is no sacrifice in tow except his boy. And he looks to the mountain and he says, I know your promise, God. I know your promise. I've lived it. I've suffered through it. I've seen the fulfillment of it. We will go to the mountain and we will return. By faith, he walks up to the mountain. Now, worst case scenario, we see in Hebrews, he understands that God could even raise him from the dead. In a time where resurrection wasn't even spoken. We look at the entirety of the Bible and understand resurrection. Abraham, doesn't happen. But he knows God's promise. And if you're requiring him, then you will provide a sacrifice. Even if it is him and you have to raise him up. So we see faith. We see faith on Abraham's part. Let me read this quote to you. The first time God told Abraham to go was when he left his home to go to a land which I will show you. The remarkable act of trust was based on the promise that God would make through him and his descendants a great nation. When Abraham was asked to give his son Isaac, the same command was given, to go to a mountain. I will show you. Abraham could not have missed the connection being made between the two commands and promises. God has been bringing Abraham to this place his entire life. He commanded him to go. That was the first test. He went. Now he's commanding him to go to a mountain, and he moves. God has been faithful the entire journey. Let me read to you Hebrews chapter 11 so we can hear directly from the author of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 through 19 says this: By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered Isaac. And he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son. It was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. So even there would imply that maybe he thought there was other options until the end. But at the end he knew that he was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So we see this faith of the father of the faith, Abraham, as he is willing to walk up that mountain with his boy, with the wood on his back. So now you're going to see a picture of the city of David. So the Jebusites owned Jerusalem. That was their city, the Jebusites. So David comes to the Jebusite city and they shout down at him. They say, are we dogs that you come and you're going to fight us? You're going to defeat us? The Jebusites are mocking him from the tops of the city walls. Well, David and his mighty men tunnel in through the Gihon Springs. Gihon Springs is going to be on the Kidron Valley side. They made a wall around the Gihon Springs since then because of this. But David tunnels in through the Gihon Springs. You can still see that tunnel to this day. I've been in it. I haven't crawled up it because I need some ropes. But you can go under the city of David and you can see where the Gihon Springs used to be, the Gihon Springs that are still flowing. And when you walk through the tunnel there, what you're going to find is that there's water, and at times it's up to your waist. It's a really cool experience. You're in this dark cave, you have a headlight on, and there's crystal clear spring water up to your waist. The Gihon Springs still produces. It was the water source for Jerusalem. Well, David and his mighty men, they tunnel in through that, and you can see where they tunneled in and wore away the rock in order to make a tunnel, in order to go up inside of the city. And so they go up inside of the city, and then they destroy the Jebusite city. David then makes that the capital city of his kingdom. So far, we've had Saul as a king, Shaul. Now we have the Davidic kingdom. And they have conquered the Jebusite city. This is the history, but it didn't go back just to David and the Jebusites. We've already tracked it back all the way to Abraham. This is the city. At that time, you'll see up above that is Mount Moriah. At that point, there had not been city walls built around it yet, and no temple had been erected on Mount Moriah. So you can see this in its growing stages, as we saw the beginning pictures where there was nothing there. The Jebusites make a city, David conquers it, and later they build a temple on Mount Moriah, which is above that. Next, you're going to see this faith of Abraham as he moves toward, we see it in Hebrews, we see it as he moves day by day toward this. Now, there's something the Jewish people still do to this day, and it's called the binding of Isaac. When you get to Temple Mount and you go to pray at the Western Wall, what you'll find are they're taking these leather straps and they're binding them around their arms tightly, these leather straps. They're usually connected to a box, and inside of that box, like the one you see on his head, is sometimes on the hand, and it has scripture inside of it. This is the binding of Isaac. They're remembering the binding of Isaac. I want you to think about that for a minute. Your boy. We've walked through the process of his development and your affection for him and your love for your son, your only son, your beloved son. The moment of binding. Let's keep reading in verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. Whew. Let me read to you an excerpt from a rabbinic literature. It says this: because of the reality of mass crucifixion, the Jewish sages, speaking of crucifixion in the first century, describe Isaac as a condemned man with wood on his shoulders, just like a cross. Even the Jewish people in the first century understood the relation to Isaac and their modern day tool of execution of the Romans, crucifixion. And they related Isaac as a condemned man with a cross on his back. How interesting is that when we understand the fulfillment of that? Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. Then he took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, come on, man, listen to this. Abraham, my father. What is it, my son? He replied, here is the fire and the wood. Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham's response, God will provide for himself the lamb of the burnt offering, my son. Abraham replied. The two of them continued together. Any fathers in here today? This interaction, Dad, he can talk now. He's not a baby. He's a little boy, young man. Dad, Isaac didn't say, what are we doing? He knew. They understood sacrifice. It's common. Like I said, it's at the root of who we are. It's something that was practiced in that day, a sacrifice. He knew of sacrifice. He didn't say, what are we doing? He knew what they were doing. Dad, we got wood. We got fire. Daddy, Father, where's the lamb? My son, God will provide a sacrifice. Now, they ascend the mountain. Let's continue as we look at, we're going to see one more picture here, which is the further development of Temple Mount and when the Solomonic kingdom reigned and the temple was finally built. But we move on to our last point, the lamb. I'm sorry, our second to last point. Let's read in verse 6 and 8. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put his son Isaac on it. Then he took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to, let me move on. Verse 8, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Abraham replied. The two of them continued on together. Let's go to verse 9. When they came to the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he tied up his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Now there's no questions. Isaac knows what's happening. Now, Abraham's over 100, and Isaac is old enough to talk. He's old enough to understand what sacrifice is, and now he's old enough to understand what's happening. I don't know what this looks like. Many have speculated. But you as a father can only imagine as you take your son and you begin to bind him up. Dad, he's already asked where the sacrifice is. Now he knows. Now, some have even speculated now that Isaac is also complicit, that he's an obedient son and he's willing to. And I would agree, Abraham is over 100 and Isaac is old enough to really give up a fight. I think I could take a 100-year-old man, possibly. Depends. But at the very least, he could put up a fight. As he binds him up. Now, why the binding? If he's completely complicit, we can only speculate in a scenario like that. But we see the lamb. I want you to think, as they walk up that mountain together, when the revelation hits Isaac, when he's still looking around, there still is no lamb. They're on top of Mount Moriah. There still is no lamb. As they prepare for the sacrifice. This is a modern day picture from the Kidron Valley looking upward, and it's going to show you that elevation once again. The left corner at the top is the corner of Temple Mount. That would be the southeast corner of Temple Mount. So you can imagine as they're walking up step by step up this mountain till they arrive at the top, and there still is no sacrifice. Our last point of the day, sacrifice. Let's read the rest of that. We'll start in verse 10 where we stopped off. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife, and prepared to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he answered. Do not harm the boy, the angel said. Do not do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God because you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. Did God already know that? Yes. But Abraham had to walk through it. You did not withhold your only son from me. What I want you to realize here is the fact he says his name twice. Tells me that Abraham now was resolved to do what God had called him to do. There was no sacrifice provided up until this third day. There's nothing on the journey up Mount Moriah provided. And now he's already bound his son, put him on the altar, and his boy is right there. The knife is raised, and he says, Abraham, Abraham. I believe, because Abraham was so resolved to do what God had called him to do, he was convinced, and that was going to die, and he knew it was going to die, but he knew that God could raise him up. This was it. It was over. You know, you hear this from time to time, that you have to let something die so that it can be reborn, but the only problem with that is our whole concept is on the idea that it will be reborn. The solution and the remedy of it. Like, God, if I give this to you, you're going to give it back to me. What if he doesn't? And unless you're willing to give it completely without getting it back, is it really sacrifice? Or are you just getting to get? Well, Lord, if I surrender this to you, you're going to give it back to me 4 times and 2 times. And how about if I give this to you and it dies and never comes back? You're enough. Because when something dies, it dies. It dies in our hearts. We understand there's no other options, and it's God's, and it's God's alone. That's death. Not the pretending that you're killing something that because you know you're going to get it back. Let's say it's the opposite. It's the knowing you may never get it back, or you will never get it back, because something is dead. It doesn't come back. But Abraham knew. So we have the sacrifice. And we find now another picture done with a rock here. And seeing where possibly this happened. On top of Temple Mount, ancient Mount Moriah. Warren Wiersbe says it like this. It's not enough for us to have the Spirit. The Spirit must have us. It's not enough for us to have the Spirit. The Spirit must have us. This testing process is one that Abraham, I've tested you. And you're mine. You've given it all. You haven't withheld your only son. I have all of you. You've completely surrendered to this process. You've walked through it, which is what you needed to do to be where you're at today. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24 and 25 says it this way. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. What is the cross? It's the form of capital punishment in the first century. It's where you go to die. If anyone would come after me, Jesus says, he must deny himself and die. Take up your cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Men, are you clinging to your old miserable life? Your old miserable ideas? Or have you gotten to a place, the testing of God, where you've surrendered it all? You said, God, if that job never comes back, I slay it. God, if this marriage breaks apart, I want this to work, and I love my wife and my children. But God, if it goes, you're enough. Will God resurrect it? Maybe. But that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the death side of it. The willingness to lay a knife in it and let it die. Because He's enough. I was brought to this place in my life and my marriage was on the rocks in this program, and I desperately wanted my wife to take me back, and I tried to manipulate her on the phone left and right to get her to understand why I did the things I did, and I desperately was trying to cling to that and control that. But it had to get to a point where I said, God, if it all falls apart, you are enough. Not my kids, not my wife, not my job, nothing compares to you. And I give it all to you. I lay it on an altar and I raise a knife with a dead set willingness to end all of it in your name. Did He want it? Did He need it? No. He wants you. And your heart, and all of you, every bit of you. So we take up our cross and we follow Him. We die to self and we live to Him. We see the end of the story. We're starting at the beginning. We see in Scriptures that this is not the first time this mountain has been spoken of, and it is not the last time this mountain has been spoken of. Let me tie ancient Mount Moriah to modern day Temple Mount in closing. 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 28. At that time when David saw that the Lord responded to him at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, he sacrificed there. A plague had broken out in Israel. You saw the Davidic kingdom, and that Temple Mount had not been created yet. Temple had not yet been built by Solomon. This is an area owned by a Jebusite named Araunah. He goes, and in order to stay the plague of Israel, he offers a sacrifice there. Go down to verse 1 of chapter 22. David then said, "This is the place where the temple of the Lord God will be, along with the altar for burnt sacrifice for Israel." Let's fast forward to the Solomonic kingdom. 2 Chronicles chapter 3. We see that Solomon fulfills his father's wishes. This very mountain, Moriah, where Abraham offers Isaac. This very mountain, Moriah, where David offers a sacrifice and purchased the threshing floor of Araunah. 2 Chronicles chapter 3. Solomon began building the Lord's temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. This was the place that David prepared at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. We start at the beginning. Ancient Mount Moriah. So now we understand the history of this plot of ground, the history of this geography. We started with the temple. We understand what it means and how important this plot of ground is. And when Jesus is teaching daily in the temple, we understand the fulfillment of all things. That ultimately, He crosses the Kidron Valley after being rejected and betrayed by one of His own. They drag Him from authority to authority till ultimately all of this area is Mount Moriah. He ascends up Mount Moriah, not the Dome of the Rock, but just on the other side, the back side of Mount Moriah, where Golgotha sits. just outside the city gates. And he drags a cross on his back, just like Isaac had wood placed upon his back. And he drags it to the top. You see, Isaac was never to be offered. It was always Jesus. And my friend, he was complicit because he says, no one takes my life. Not the Jewish people, not the Romans. No one takes my life, but I give it freely. And like a condemned man, he drags the cross to the top of Mount Moriah. So worn out from the journey, he drops the cross at one point, even so beaten and his back laid open from the cat of nine tails. So worn out and beaten and stricken, carrying the weight of the sin of the world on his back. And there, on top of Mount Moriah, the fulfillment. It was always him. It's always been him. And at the heart of world religion, at the heart of humanity, is the understanding of sacrifice. My friend, it's all pointing to him. And that day, no one takes his life. He freely gives it. For he could have called a legion of angels and leveled the entire city. But just like Isaac, he's laid down, and ultimately he gives his life as a ransom for many. Men, we start at the beginning. Let's bow our heads. God, we love you and we thank you.